Hello, my name is Johna Johnson, and I'm the CEO and founder of Nemertes Research. Welcome to our monthly webinar entitled Crafting an Effective Incident Response Policy. This webinar consists of an interactive presentation and moderated Q&A period. To submit a question, please use the control panel on GoToWebinar. If you experience any technical difficulties, please contact webinars@nemertes.com. Upon conclusion of the webinar, you will be presented with a short survey. Please answer any questions to provide feedback on this webinar and content for future webinars. We also ask if you would like to participate in our research. In exchange for your participation, you will receive access to our research. A replay will soon be available for viewing on our website. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and kick it off and talk about crafting an effective incident response policy. So first, I will introduce Nemertes for those of you who are less than perfectly familiar with us. Then we're going to jump in and talk about some key definitions. And you will all probably laugh at me because I think everyone who has registered to attend is fairly sophisticated in the security front. But you'll find that making those definitions crystal clear is actually key in developing an effective IRP. Then we'll talk about some of the critical components of an effective IRP, including prioritization, communications, how to respond, creating a chain of evidence using automated auditing, and the most important, the post-mortem. Then we'll talk about some additional best practices and sum up into recommendations. Then give you some tips and guidance for more information, introduce our next webinar, and cut over to the Q&A. Sound good? Let's get going. So we are a global IT research and strategic consulting firm. We focus on the business impact of emerging technology. That means we look at operational metrics, we look at business metrics, and business value metrics as emerging technology comes along. You can see the topics that we cover, the types of research we conduct, and the services we provide. I do want to highlight that a lot of the insight in this particular webinar comes from our security and risk management study that we conducted earlier this year. This is an annual study that we conduct on an ongoing basis, and I'll talk a bit more about what goes into that study shortly. So this is us. We've been doing this for 15 years, and our clients seem pretty happy with what we're doing, and hopefully you will be happy with the webinar as well. So let's jump in and talk about some definitions. First one is, what is an incident? And I realize that sounds like the simplest, stupidest question you can start this with. And those of you who are CISOs, and I know you're there listening, are thinking, I know exactly what a security incident is, but do you? I do want to highlight that for the purposes of this webinar, we are actually drawing quite heavily from the NIST framework, and in particular their special publication 800-61 Rev 2, which is SP 800-61 Rev 2. That's something that we are actually quite familiar with. We have worked with the folks at NIST, and we have published some work on how to translate the NIST framework into risk. And one of the things we're very aware of, and you may well be aware of as well, is that NIST proposes definitions that seem clear until you drill down into them. One of the things that's very interesting is NIST actually defines an incident as a kind of a known security problem. Very specifically, what they actually say is it's a violation or imminent threat of violation of computer security policies, acceptable use policies, or standard security practices. So it's a bit of a circular definition. And then it goes on to give you some examples. The key thing about this is that a security incident, according to NIST, is something anomalous that's happened that has been determined to be an attack. So, first of all, the whole process of conducting this detection, analysis, containment, and remediation, which is kind of incident response in a nutshell, that process we have actually benchmarked as taking, on average, 39 days at organizations. We're going to talk about why it takes so long in the upcoming slides and how those differences play out. But for the purposes of the definitions, the key thing is you don't know you have an incident until halfway through the entire process, because you've detected something, but all you know is it's an anomalous event. You don't know whether this event, in fact, does indicate what NIST describes as violation or imminent threat of violation of computer security policies. You don't know that yet because you have to conduct the analysis to confirm that, in fact, it is an incident. And interestingly, that means that the time to detect the incident actually encompasses both the detection and the analysis component, which is not actually half of those 39 days because statistics are a little bit devious here. But the key point, again, is for the purpose of your policy, the policy picks up once you know that the incident truly is an incident and not just an anomaly. So let's circle back to this question of how long does that take? And it really depends who you are. We benchmarked, and this is where I mentioned our study, we looked at 625 organizations in 12 countries. We looked at the amount of time it took to conduct each of those phases. And we actually asked people in interviews. So these were live interviews where we asked people questions, and we also very carefully, we surveyed folks, but we made it very clear what our definitions were in that previous slide, so people were giving us as accurate information as they could. And what we found is that for highly successful organizations, there's basically two clumps, technical term there, two clumps of responses. The median time to detect an incursion, some kind of incursion, you haven't figured out whether it's an attack or not, is about an hour. But for well-performing companies, there are two clusters, folks who say it takes about 10 minutes and folks who say it takes about 30 minutes. And then that, other group of companies say it takes days to weeks. So one of the things to think about is you want a system in place that enables you to detect an anomaly very, very quickly. That's why companies are implementing things like behavioral threat analytics tools, which our competitors, Gartner, like to call UEBA tools. These are tools that in an automated fashion detect anomalies and really parse through them to determine whether an anomaly really is a threat, which gets us to the next chunk. So your goal should be to detect an anomaly in an order of minutes. If you're taking longer than that, you are not a top performer. Then it should take you at most a couple of hours to figure out whether that anomaly is in fact an attack or an incident. The median time, again, is 3 hours, but as you can see, it's kind of clustered. You get a couple of bumps up there that say it's under 3 hours, and the top performers are looking at it in 30 minutes or less. The lower performers are, again, taking days to weeks. And that's actually very typical for a long-tailed distribution. These are not Gaussian distributions. If you dig into your memory of, a college and grad school statistics, these are actually long-tailed, which means for some companies, the answer to how long it takes may be never. In which case, I would suggest if you are one of those companies, you do not need an incident response policy. You need much better detection mechanisms, and what we call table stakes in the information security space. Anyway, bottom line, your goal as an organization should be to detect and determine that something is an incursion or a threat within, at most, hours, ideally within minutes. And that's, once you've determined that, that's when the incident response policy kicks in. Before that, it's not part of the incident response policy. It's actually owned by SecOps, security operations. The incident response policy means you are now engaging the incident response team. But now, let's talk about some of the other words that can be defined here. First of all, people use policy, plan, and process as interchangeable, and they really shouldn't be. I know they all begin with P, but that's not a good enough reason to use all of them. What NIST likes to talk about is this notion of a policy as not just the rules and guidelines, which is what most people understand and interpret a policy as, but actually really describe explicitly how the rules are executed on, particularly when it comes to plans and procedures and checklists. And NIST in particular kind of uses policy as almost this umbrella. But they're also very prescriptive when it comes to what needs to go into the actual policy document. So it's worth going through all of these in a little bit of detail. As I mentioned, the policy actually has the rules and the guidelines, and they must be a risk-based approach. What we mean by that is you need to look at what ought to be done based on the threat posed to the organization. And crucially, this is very, very crucial, the policy is the document that defines the roles and responsibilities, but does not assign the humans to the roles. In other words, the policy might talk about an incident response team that is headed by an incident response manager whose roles and responsibilities are enumerated below. It doesn't say Johna Johnson is the incident response manager on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and Bob Smith is on Tuesdays and Thursdays, or whatever. It just says here are the roles and responsibilities. The reason for that is the plan and process will then kick back and actually address that, address those roles and responsibilities, and really tie that directly into the roles and responsibilities. The key thing that the plan has to have is, well, certainly the strategy and goals, but also the metrics. You know, the policy is going to say something like, our policy is to ensure an effective incident response that minimizes the risk to the company. The plan goes one step further and says an effective incident response policy is one that delivers on these metrics, whether it's remediates the threat within, you know, half an hour, whether it responds to, you know, the larger organization. We'll talk about the communication, whether the response and the communications happens within, you know, an hour. It literally gives you metrics so that when you have executed on the IRP, when an incident occurs, you can go back and say, how did we do against the metrics? And finally, the plan really needs to provide an overall alignment with everything else in your organization. One thing that we have long conversations about is whether there really is such a thing as a cybersecurity incident response policy, because at the end of the day, everything is an incident. A hurricane is an incident. Disaster recovery is an incident. Cybersecurity is just a special case of a special kind of incident. And the plan should provide for that overall alignment and provide those hooks into other policies and plans that are relevant. And finally, the process and procedures. That's the techniques and the forms. That's where you've got the checklists, and that's the part where you say Johna Johnson is the you know, general manager of the incident response team, or whatever, however you've done that. And if you think about it, the process needs to be updated considerably more often than the policy. There are only a few reasons to update the policy, either when you've made a strategic change to the organization's stance on risk or cybersecurity, or when you've uncovered a weakness in the policy that was instantiated in the plan and process. The process, on the other hand, as we'll see, needs to get updated on a fairly regular basis as people change roles, people change jobs, new organizations come and go. So, you know, kind of think about this as the rate of update is inversely proportional to the height here. So policy gets updated, changed, I would say, least frequently, process most frequently. So let's move on and talk about what some of the key components of this policy would be. The first one is prioritization. And this is something where I see a lot of companies making one of two mistakes. The first one is they don't prioritize incidents at all. So something happens and everyone goes into full-blown battle stations, whether it's a small thing or a big thing, because they haven't done any of the planning that says what is a small thing and what is a big thing. The flip side, and the other big mistake, is that people create extremely complicated processes or structures for deciding severity. You know, they might have a 17-point checklist, and you could be, you know, severity 17A by this checklist. Keep in mind that the whole purpose of prioritizing an incident is figuring out really quickly what you need to do about it. So you want your incident response team to be able to look at what just happened, quickly assign a priority, and then take actions that align with the priority assignment. So you don't want to make this a hard process that requires a supercomputer, superconducting super collider, to figure out everything that you need to do. You want this to be a process that is quick and easy for possibly a fairly stressed incident response team to make a good decision, not necessarily the perfect decision, and move on. So look at things like which systems and data have been compromised, how deep does the compromise run, how widespread is it? Does it affect all employees' systems or devices, or only some? And what does it mean to affect them? What's the impact? Does it mean that there are processes that can't occur, or processes that can occur normally but shouldn't? You know, really, if you look at severity, scope, and impact, you're able to create something that really says, you know, low, medium, high, with some clear examples of how to create prioritization. Our rule of thumb is don't go further than 5 levels because it gets confusing past that. 3 is even better. So to sum up, the best prioritization scheme is simple, clear. It's something you can apply on the fly. It doesn't require an advanced degree in mathematics to apply. It may include a few examples so people can quickly pigeonhole what the incident is. Shouldn't go longer than 5 levels, and it uses intuitive labeling, you know, low, medium, high, low, moderate, severe. And most importantly, it aligns with the corporate risk definitions. If you have corporate risk definitions already, you should be able to quickly correlate those to cybersecurity risk. And again, it's better to have a good heuristic than to try to make it perfect. This is a tool that's going to be grabbed in an emergency, so plan for it that way. The next critical component is communication, and this is one that even incredibly sophisticated organizations get wrong because they're so busy responding to the incident that they forget that a huge piece of what needs to happen is telling people about the incident. And there are two sets of stakeholders, internal and external. Here we're going to talk about the internal stakeholders. Obviously, you need to communicate with, the incident response teams as defined by the policy, IT and InfoSec. Also, you probably want to start to talk to legal, risk, and compliance and give them direct communications. Guess what? The business needs to know about this. The business leadership and the board needs to know about this. And crucially, there are other components, other groups like human resources or personnel, client services and sales, and of course, public and investor relations if you're going to be starting to formulate a message to the outside world. I won't name names, but in the recent Heartbleed attack, there was one very major credit card company that did everything right internally, but forgot the whole notion of internal stakeholders and communications and forgot or didn't realize that they needed to update their contact center folks so that the morning Heartbleed became general knowledge, people opened up the Wall Street Journal and literally opened up a physical newspaper in a lot of cases or clicked on it online and started calling the contact centers saying, hey, am I at risk? And the poor contact center agents were sitting there going, I don't even know what you're talking about. That's the kind of thing we're talking about that can't happen, and that needs to be very spelled out in the, in the policy plan and process. So at what point does client services get told? What do they get told? How much do they get told? And how often do they get updated? And we'll sum all that up in a second. Then, of course, there are the external stakeholders, law enforcement. Kind of obvious, but very important. A lot of times organizations don't want to reach out to law enforcement and they miss out on assistance they could have otherwise gotten. You also, compliance and regulatory agencies, this may be required and mandated. In fact, a lot of financial firms in New York, which is where I am, are dealing with the consequence of New York State Department of Financial Services Part 500, New York State DFS Part 500, which mandates a very specific communications process that kicks off within hours of the discovery of an incident. So you probably want to know what those are and build them into your policy and process. You probably also want to talk to your customers, suppliers, and partners because not only do they need to know, but they also may need to protect themselves depending on the nature of the attack. And as you can imagine from previously, you probably want to talk to the media. You may need to be posting things, tweeting things, telling people, what's going on, and anyone that's handling brand management. And you may be part of a consortium in your industry that has other incident response teams like the ISACAs. You may want to be talking to those. Just be clear that these are not comprehensive lists. These are folks you might want to consider having a nailed down process to communicate with based on the severity of the incident, based on the scope of the incident. Obviously you don't have to tell them every little thing, but you need to clarify, make it unambiguous when you do in fact need to tell people things. So what do we mean by tell people things and make it unambiguous? One of the most important things you can do is pre-script your messages. So you can send out messages saying, we have detected an incident of severity X. Here is what the current process is. We will alert you at time Y, or something like that. If this stuff is already written, you can hit a button and send it. You may need to tweak it very slightly to address the current situation. That's going to cut down on errors, that's going to cut down on risk, and that's going to vastly improve the quality of your communication because you aren't forcing people to compose messages that may be kind of sensitive at a time when they're stressed and pressed for time. A second bullet item, be proactive and give updates at regular intervals. For those of us who've been watching Hurricanes Harvey and Irma, we have embedded in our brains exactly when NOAA is going to be giving us updates, and I'm sure quite a lot of you were there with me clicking on the refresh button at 10:59 because we knew the next update was coming in at 11, whether it was 11 a.m. or 11 p.m. It was 2 a.m., 11, 11, 5, and then they kicked to hourly as it really started. Most recently, Irma started coming over Florida. That's the kind of predictability you really want to be providing, because it gives you a confidence level. It gives you, the people you're communicating with, a confidence level in your control of the situation and your management of the situation, that you are proactively updating people and not waiting for them to call. Finally, the contacts need to be current. This sounds kind of obvious, but it's actually one of the biggest mistakes our clients make. They sit down, they have a big love fest, they build out their IRP, they put all the contact information in there, and then they don't update it for a year or 2 or 3 or 5, and when they go to need it, they discover that all the contacts are out of date. We'll talk about a process for making sure that never happens to you as we scoot on, but that's another key thing to think about. Okay, what about the response? Well, you've seen this, you've seen this slide before. What I'm about to tell you is you would expect this presentation to have lots of details about the technical capabilities for performing detection, analysis, containment, and remediation. There are all sorts of tools and processes and metrics. All I will tell you is this is not that presentation. That's the area where most of our clients actually spend most of their time and do a reasonably good job. They already have the tools in place. They worry about, the area where a lot of companies are focusing right now is the detection analysis component, so that they can be kicking their IRP into place earlier. Containment requires a fair amount of automation, which people are also putting into place, and remediation requires both that and higher level skill sets. So the one thing I would say is this is an entire discipline in and of itself. This is something we work with clients on a regular basis. The key thing here is to recognize that the more you automate, the more efficient you are. And one of the interesting little tidbits we find in our benchmark research is that the most successful companies based on operational metrics, so the ones that are able to detect in minutes rather than hours or days, also tend to spend a little less per employee than their peers. And the reason for that is because they've deployed automation. So again, there's a whole nother discussion about that, but this presentation assumes you're doing a pretty good job for each of these steps in here in the response. Another area that people tend to forget a lot is this component of auditing and creating and maintaining a chain of evidence. And people look at this and say, a chain of evidence, doesn't that sound like, CSI or, one of those Law and Order? And it's, yes, as a matter of fact, that's exactly what needs to happen. And I mentioned automation. That can become key when you're doing incident logging, because what you want to capture are a mix of human actions and human beings and human contacts and mechanical or system level data. So for instance, you want to capture, location, serial number, model number, host name, MAC address, IP address, and any other, session number for any sessions that have been detected, any applications that have been detected. Whatever it is you're capturing, you want to capture at a technical level. You also want to have the information about the actual human who collected that information or handled the evidence. Literally, you want to be able to prove, if you're ever in a court of law, that somebody didn't change the logs, that the bad guy really did do the bad thing. And the best way you can do that, again, is using automation, so that this stuff is time-stamped, name-stamped, and everything else without human intervention. That's the best possible way you can do it. So again, I mentioned time-stamped. You want time and date, including time zone, and locations where the evidence has been. So if all this information is now living on a hard drive somewhere or a solid-state drive in somebody's laptop, where has that machine been, and was there any possibility that it was tampered with? I know it all sounds very, very guns and robbers, but it does become important if you're ever in a position where you can actually bring these people to court. So that's another thing to be thinking about. I mentioned this at the beginning. The post-mortem review is absolutely critical. The post-mortem review is one of the most important things you can do as part of your incident response process. And as a matter of fact, NIST devotes an entire chapter to what you should do as part of your post-mortem, who should be in it, who should be, who should participate, how quickly it should happen. But I think the key thing that I really want people to understand is that it's important not only to have it, but it's important to take the mindset of, we're not seeking to cast blame, we're seeking to capture information. And a really useful model in putting together this postmortem review is the way the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, focuses on fact-finding, not fault-finding. And if you read those reports, they've been absolutely critical in reducing, airline fatalities, shipping fatalities, loss of life, loss of property across the board, because they are scrupulous about looking at what happened and not pointing fingers. It's really important to have that culture when you're building your postmortem review. So some other key practices, try to hold within 72 hours, include a broad range of stakeholders, the people you've communicated with, so you can ask questions like, hey, we updated you hourly. Did you read those results? Did you get those updates? Did you read them? Were they too long? Were they too short? Again, not finger pointing, but allows you to tweak so it's a better way to communicate. Another key point, so you're addressing the successes and failures. I think I covered that. Another key point is you really want not just a meeting, but an actual report. The NTSB, as you know, creates reports, and they're actually riveting reading if you're a weird sort of person, which I am, because you can read about, Russian pilots in the North Sea, and shipping collisions and what happens, what happens then. It can be quite riveting reading. But you do want to create that output report that becomes part of the IRP archive. And what that means is as you hire new people, as your organization grows and changes, that becomes part of the institutional knowledge that a newbie can quickly and easily come up to speed on and understand, for example, why certain policies and processes got changed. And we'll talk about that in a minute. The key thing is, once you've generated the output report, you use that to make changes to the, policy plans and processes, but realistically, you're going to make changes in the inverse order. The processes are the things that probably failed the most. The plan was probably okay, and the policy is unlikely to need changing unless there was something super egregious. But when you do make those changes, you can also indicate why you made the changes. So essentially what you're saying is, hey, based on the results of, the IRP, or the ISB, the Information Safety Board's review on September 12th, 2017, we have determined that the following changes are necessary to make. Then somebody reading that can then look back, read the report, and go, oh, okay, that makes sense. That was the right process to change. And so that becomes a living, breathing document and also guidance as to why certain things are the way they are. So with that, we've highlighted the key components. We've highlighted some of the key definitions. And again, the key components that I'm stressing are not the only and most important ones. They're the ones that incident response teams often forget or don't focus on. This is based on our work with clients. We've looked at this and said, this is where most people make the mistakes. So if you're listening to this and you're going, hey, we've got all of that nailed, pat yourself on the back because you're probably doing pretty well. So let's jump on the last two best practices and what we see, here as good ways to improve what's already good. First one is the concept of wargaming. Remember I mentioned that you may be making changes to your policies, processes, and procedures. One way to make changes is when an actual incident happens. Another way to make changes is when you're actually conducting war games. War games can be fun, but in order for them to be effective, they also have to be a little bit difficult. So what we mean is you should, pick teams, include multiple forms of failure. What do I mean by that? Set up a scenario that's a hypothetical scenario. Okay, we've been hacked. It's hit these systems. It's hit those systems. And oh gosh, the guy who's supposed to be the general manager of the incident response team is out with the flu. Or, gee, the guy that's supposed to be the general manager is out with the flu, and we just lost our data center for reasons that we don't understand. It could have been an earthquake, it could have been a flood, or it could have been related to this hack. In other words, throw wild cards in there and watch the team respond. The first time you do it, if you've never done these before, I guarantee you the first time you do it is where you uncover all, turn over all the stones and see all the ugliness at the bottom with the little squirmy insecty things, because that's what's going to stress your incident response plan more than anything. My colleague Erwin Lazar used to serve in the Army, and he used to joke that, no combat plan survives first contact with the enemy. And it really is true. And that's why the military does wargaming, and that's why we're using this military example of wargaming, because as soon as things start going sideways, that's where you see the weaknesses of your plans and your preparations. So you should be conducting a regular revision and review of the IRP as an output of that war game, and you should be creating those reports just as you create reports for real incidents. You should create reports for war games, and any changes that you make to the policy, to the IRP, you should indicate why you're making them based on the output of the war games. Last but not least, when it comes to revision and review, you should be doing paper reviews of the IRP at least quarterly. I mentioned the whole issue of what do you do when the contact names are no longer valid? Well, one of the things you should be doing is checking to make sure at a very basic level, hey, our contact person is, Mary Smith over here at the FBI. Is it still Mary? Somebody needs to call. Hey, FBI, is it still Mary Smith we're supposed to be reaching out to? Is it still, Bob Jones who's heading, who is our liaison within HR for our own organization, and so forth. And by the way, those tests should actually literally be what I've said. You should try to contact the person and validate that they truly are who they claim to be, because one of the other weaknesses that we've found is many times companies will have listed in their IRPs contacts who don't even know their contacts and don't even agree to the roles and responsibilities that are defined. And so that's a very key component. That person needs to actually sign off on not only that they're still there and that they're still at their job in their other external department, but that they understand their role with respect to incident response. Timing on this, at least quarterly. It's tedious and nobody likes to do it. Fortunately, it's not as much work as doing a full-on war game, and it's not as stressful as responding to an incident. So please do, budget the time to do that and make the revisions. What else? Well, you should document. Documentation is your friend. Checklists are lovely. This is why pilots use them. So you should have checklists of steps to be completed for specific incident types. And in fact, I skimmed over this because it's not usually a problem as much as prioritization, but you should categorize your incident types so that you know, roughly speaking, various broad strategies that you take, depending on the type of incursion, the type of threat, what has been, what information has been captured. Are you looking at a DDoS? Are you looking at, well, I should say, are you looking at a DOS? Are you, denial of service attack? Are you looking at a, capture of sensitive information being compromised? Are you looking at systems coming down? Types of attacks should broadly have checklists of steps that you tackle in order to address those. There should be a very short description of the incident prioritization scheme, literally one page. You should be able to look at that and know within a high degree of accuracy how severe any given incident is. We talked about the list of the internal contacts and the external contacts that need to be updated on a regular basis. You might also want a list of relevant city, state, national, and international laws and any of the notification requirements there. In other words, the person looking at this may not be up to speed with the fact that, you have to respond to a particular agency within a certain amount of time. It's good to know that. If you have regulatory documents, for example, I mentioned NFS DFS Part 500, if you have to complete documents for that, or there are sites that you have to jump onto and complete information in a portal, those hyperlinks should be there. You should have an incident report template that's pretty straightforward for the response team. And of course, we mentioned copies of postmortems for previous incidents and war games. All of those should be there. Fortunately, we're not talking necessarily about paper. This can, certainly be a virtual document with links. And finally, definitions of internal or technical acronyms or terms. So these, I'm kind of reading this and it sounds commonsensical if you look at this, but you'd be surprised how many organizations think they've done a good job when they've, kind of hand-waved at a very high level. It's our policy to respond to all incidents within, immediately and notify all relevant people quickly and take all appropriate action. There, I've got an IRP. No, you really need this level of detail, and it becomes a working toolkit or blueprint that you can use to really handle your response process. And certainly you can work with your SecOps team to develop this, and in fact, some of the same people maybe, have dual roles, but you don't necessarily need to draw your entire incident response team from SecOps. So it's great. Bottom line is it's great to have this additional documentation. Okay. So boiling it all up into a couple of recommendations, think in terms of policy plan and procedures or process that are separate. A policy is not a plan is not the procedures and process. And critically, the policy defines roles and responsibilities. The plan defines the strategy and goals, and the procedures and process are that checklist of steps and the assignment of individual names to the roles that are identified in the policy. Make sure that you've got well-documented, detailed plans for internal and external communication, and that you practice them frequently on wargaming, as we'll see. Reference these classes of attacks and attack vectors that are consistent with those that your SecOps team has defined. Make sure that you've got documented and auditable logs for every step of an incident. These can, again, be online. Do automate as much as possible your incident logging because that will ensure your chain of command or chain of evidence is more impregnable, and it also saves a lot of time and overhead. And second set of recommendations, try to make your prioritization as simple and as effective as possible. Think about aligning with overall risk to the organization. To answer the question, how bad is it? Ask yourself, how much risk does this expose us to, and of what sort, and how broadly? And that should get you to your high, medium, low, or whatever your prioritization is. Please, 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 if you do nothing else, make sure you have a postmortem after every major incident. And again, don't focus on fault finding, do focus on fact finding, figure out what happened. A favorite technique of mine when we're trying to figure out when something broke, why did it break, is the 5 whys. Ask, why did this happen? Then why did the thing that caused that to happen, and keep digging. And you usually find the problem is not human error. People want to throw themselves under the bus and say, oh, it's human error, but really it's not. Typically, it's a design flaw or a process flaw that you can improve, so that even though people aren't perfect, you can continually improve the process and reduce the likelihood of human error. I should have said this before, but I will tell you this story now. For a very long time, the people that made ATMs discovered that there was a huge problem, which is people would put their card in, the ATM would hang onto their card, it would dispense the money, and then spit out the card. And amazingly enough, quite a lot of us would walk away from the ATM machine, leaving our card in the machine once we got our money. So either the problem was customers are stupid, or as the ATM and the banks figured out, the real problem is the process is dumb. You should give the card back before the money comes out, which is what all ATMs do now. But it was the simple step of, oh gosh, people walk away because they have their immediate need gratified, they have their money, and they forget about their longer term need, which is to hang on to the ATM card. And it was expensive for the banks because they had to cancel the ATM and reissue it and cover the cost of any abuse. So bottom line, if you can hold these postmortems, don't focus on finger pointing, do focus on fact finding, you can attain continuous improvement. Do conduct war games. Don't be put off by the militaristic sound. Essentially what you want to do is really practice these IRPs and think of the war game as practicing the IRP. That will show you where it needs modifications and strengthening. And then regardless of the war games, proactively revisit it to make sure it's up to date. So that's altogether how to build an effective IRP. Fortunately, for those of you who are saying, wow, this would be nice, but I'd really like that documented, not only will this webinar be up, posted online, you can certainly ask questions in just a minute. Rachel and I will get to some of the questions, but we also have a report that we'll link you to when we notify you that the webinar is up online, so you can read through this at your leisure. So for more information, we are also, because we're a consulting and engineering firm, we are happy to help you with a lot of this. We have our Security Strategic Support Program for technology users. We help you develop the IRP as part of that. We also conduct security assessments. We also help you develop a strategy architecture roadmap, any business cases for procuring cutting-edge technology. We assist you with vendor strategic selection, and of course, we provide this guidance on things like staffing, spending, budgeting, governance, and operations, and success metrics for organizations like yours. So the question everybody always asks us is, gee, Nemertes, there are lots of consultants in this space. What makes you special? And the answer is twofold. One is we've been doing this for a while. I started my career in the 1990s, quite a while ago. developing security software for our financial services organizations. My colleagues and I have been in this business for 50 plus years. Honestly, we could probably say 100 years, but that would make us feel old. But we also refresh our knowledge and insight on a regular basis by conducting ongoing research on 600 plus organizations in 12 countries. So we really are able to see what works. It's not just what we think is a good idea because we're smart people and have been doing this a while, but we actually base it on quantitative data, and that's what we use to guide our clients. If you're a client, please reach out to client-services@nemertes.com. If you're not a client, you should become one and reach us at sales@nemertes.com, and we will help you with your IRP efforts and anything else you're doing with security. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and give you the invitation to our next webinar, and then I think we will jump to some Q&A. So for those of you who have been listening thus far, please tune in for our next webinar, which is going to happen on Tuesday, September 19th at 2 o'clock Eastern. It is led by my colleague and partner, Robin Garris, who's Nemertes president and founder, and it is one of the first 3 webinars she's going to be doing on digital transformation, again, based on in-depth quantitative data. She's going to be providing organizational guidelines and a technology primer. And when I say these questions that she's going to answer are absolutely great questions, they are, and she's coming to it unlike anyone else in the industry with real data from real organizations that we've been helping through the digital transformation process. So tune in on Tuesday, September 19th. And with that, I believe we are ready to move to some Q&A. The first question that I've got is, Johna, there's a lot of documentation that you're talking about. How do other organizations handle the challenge of documenting all this stuff when we're shorthanded when it comes to security? That's kind of the way I'm paraphrasing this question. And the simple answer for how do you make time and find time to do this is kind of like anything else, you just do it. What we found is that oftentimes companies will hire people based not just on their technical ability, but also their ability to communicate and create documents. You'll also find that you can work with folks like us who have templates, which can expedite and accelerate your documenting process. But really, you just need to invest in someone whose job it is to actually write this stuff down and not make it the 3rd or 4th or 5th job of somebody whose job it is to actually do it. So you really need to invest in having that assistance, whether it's a third party like us or someone on your team or a combination. You have to bite the bullet and invest in that, and the companies that are successful do that. Rachel, do you have any questions in your queue?
I do not, John. I have any questions in my queue.
Okay. Well, with that, I'm going to go ahead, since we are at quarter of, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. I've either talked everybody's ear off and you're all, off doing something else. If not, or if you would like sort of more focused attention on this, please do reach out to us. We would be delighted to assist. And again, we will be putting this webinar up shortly. So I will formally wrap up. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Again, please join us for our next webinar on Tuesday, September 19th at 2 p.m. Eastern. There is a registration link on our website. And if you'd like to follow up, again, those emails are client-services@nemertes.com or sales@nemertes.com. Thank you very much, and this concludes the webinar.